Russia was once thought to be a dead power after the fall of the Soviet Union with the end of the Cold War. In the 90s, the country experienced one of its worst economic crises and suffered a humiliating defeat at the hands of Chechen insurgents during the First Chechen War and at the hands of NATO, which, contrary to Russian wishes, expanded eastwards to incorporate countries that were once part of the Warsaw Pact. Today, things have changed. The country has grown powerful, is considered a great power once again, has successfully subdued and destroyed the Chechen insurgency, and has so far prevented Georgia and Ukraine, two countries in its near abroad, from becoming members of NATO. Much of Russia's revival is attributed to Russia's president, Vladimir Putin, who entered his fifth term this year as president of the Russian Federation. Putin's leadership in the next 6 years will be instrumental for the future of the Russian Federation as the country grapples with several geopolitical realities: the rise of China and non-Western powers, the war in Ukraine, and what many analysts have called multipolarity and the collapse of the US-dominated financial system. What will Russia under Putin's new 6-year term look like? What impact will the term have on Russia's foreign policy and long-term strategy? This is Strategic Wisdom with Andrew Jose. I'm Andrew Jose, a Washington, D.C. based security policy analyst and news reporter, bringing you timely analyses and commentary on issues in international relations, war, and security policy. Joining me today is Fyodor Lukyanov, editor-in-chief of the journal Russia in Global Affairs, published by the Moscow-based Foreign Policy Research Foundation. Fyodor Lukyanov is the author of several publications on Russian foreign policy and the problems facing contemporary international relations. He is a research professor, part of the Faculty of World Economy and International Affairs at the Higher School of Economics, HSE University in Moscow, Russia. Fyodor is also research director at the esteemed Valdai Discussion Club. Like I am today, Fyodor also has worked in journalism. He was a senior editor at the International Moscow Radio, the Voice of Russia, and the editor-in-chief of Vremya Novosti. Fyodor, welcome to the show.
Hello, thank you for having me.
Before we discuss the transformation Russia's foreign policy will undergo in the next 6 years, I want to look at the phenomenon of Vladimir Putin in Russian politics. Many say he was a transformative force in Russia's post-Soviet history. Is Putin, as many say, indeed a transformative force? If so, how has Putin impacted, for the better or worse, Russia standing on the world stage, and what has Putin's role been in returning Russia to great power status?
Putin has been a transformative force. That's very easy to prove if you look at the situation almost 25 years ago, when he became first prime minister and then acting president of Russian Federation, and situation today. Of course, we see dramatic changes in both performance of Russian state, first of all internally, and the Russian place on the international stage. Having said that, I must note that whoever would replace President Yeltsin after his second term, 2000, changes were inevitable, and the situation in which Russia operated in the 1990s after the collapse of the previous statehood and enormous decline in everything, including the socio-economic situation for most people, that was an absolutely abnormal situation. President Yeltsin and his team, they tried to struggle with this. But by the end of 1990s, it was clear that something new was required to reestablish the functionality, the ability of the Russian state and the Russian economy in the first line, and of course to try to find a new positioning on the world affairs. It's a very long discussion, all those 25 years, and we don't have time for that. But I can say one thing. Yes, indeed, Putin's initial purpose, initial aim, very clearly written in his very first programmatic article, which was published the day before Yeltsin resigned and Putin was nominated as the acting president. So the main aim in this article was clear: to restore Russian place on the international stage as one of leading powers. And Putin wrote in his article that for the first time since very, very long years, decades, and maybe even centuries, it was a risk for Russia to slide down into the second or even third echelon of international powers. And that was, he wrote, the main task to prevent it from happening and to restore Russian position. We can say now, 25 years after that, of course, Putin achieved this goal. I mean that Russia is one of the most leading powers on the world stage. This is a pretty controversial situation because we understand that some people glorify this achievement, some other have diametrically opposite meaning. But of course, the place of Russia today and place of Russia 25 years ago is absolutely different. It must be noted that Putin tried hard to restore this position of Russia through different means, including his first period of rule between approximately 2000 and 2005 or 6, when he worked hard to make Russia part of the Western-led system. He was ready, I think we can interpret it this way, he was ready to make Russia be embedded in the Western-centric political and economic international system, of course on special conditions, on conditions which he and all Russians would consider as a decent place. But he was ready to make this effort, not to try to challenge the Western system, just the opposite. But it failed, I would say, for many reasons, but the most important reason, the principal reason was that the West didn't see Russia as part of its system on the more or less equal terms. And then since that, Putin started to try other means, and now we are where we are now.
In one of your recent articles in Russia in Global Affairs, titled "Putin is back for another 6 years, this is what his foreign policy will look like," you described the Ukraine conflict as a turning point that ended what you call Russia's post-Soviet rebound. What is the post-Soviet rebound and why has it ended? How do you envision Russia redefining its geopolitical strategy now that it has reached the ceiling of the rebound?
25 years after collapse of the Soviet Union, maybe slightly longer, Russian activities were directed towards attempts to compensate for the losses, I mean, geopolitical losses in terms of international posturing connected to the end of the Soviet Union. Because collapse of the Soviet Union did mean such a tremendous decline in international status of Russia that it was probably unprecedented in world history, that quickly and that profound. So many years, even a couple of decades after collapse of the Soviet Union, Russia tried to compensate for it, to make a new basis for important place on the international stage. But it was catch-up work. But that was, the ceiling has been reached approximately by mid-2010s. A Russian operation in Syria, the first overseas military campaign since collapse of the Soviet Union, was, so to say, the final step in this post-Soviet post-Soviet restoration. So Russia, and that was one of the aims of Putin, as we discussed, Russia reached the position of a country which is important not just in Eurasia, not just in the former post-Soviet space, but also worldwide in the global political constellation. And after that, the question came, what next? Because the resource of this compensatory growth, geopolitical growth, was exhausted. Profound change in Russian positioning didn't happen. So the domination of the West in the world, and especially in the Euro-Atlantic and European sphere, was still there. And the West continued the very consistent expansion of its interest and its institutions towards former Russian sphere of presence. And in this regard, what started to happen in the post-Soviet area in last decade, 2010s, not just in Russia, but in many countries like Armenia, like Ukraine, like Belarus, like other important countries, in Kazakhstan, it demonstrated that a new period began. And in this situation, Russia is in a need to find a completely new format for relationship with those old Soviet republics, because the previous model has been exhausted based on the Soviet heritage, but the new model is still not in place. And I would not say that we know exactly how to build up this relationship now. Certainly, post-Soviet area and Eurasia as a space for exclusive Russian interest has gone. We see many other powers to be present there, be it Western powers, be it China, be it India, be it Turkey, be it Iran, and so on. So I think now that we are facing this new situation, and we need still to invent how to address it.
What are the main trends we can expect in Putin's new term as it relates to Russia's foreign policy and also trade policy? What relationships Russia is most likely to prioritize, and what regions?
The obvious priority for now, and I'm afraid for the next couple of years, will be the military campaign in Ukraine, because that turned into the most important challenge to Russian quest for international influence. It wasn't meant in this way. Initially, now we understand that the initial plan of this operation was different. It was planned as a quite stormy and efficient short campaign. It didn't happen, so now we have this prolonged attrition war, which is much bigger today than when it started, because the West has engaged in a full scale on the Ukrainian side. So now, whether Russia wants it or not, this is seen as a struggle for principles, how this area, Eurasian area, will be organized in the future. I mean, in terms of security, in terms of hierarchy of influences. And I believe that this task will dominate significant part of Vladimir Putin's new term, at least for next maybe 2 years. No doubt about that. But the very campaign, the campaign itself, means that Russia needs to totally restructure its international relations. So for the first time since the collapse of the Soviet Union, or even earlier since the perestroika, Gorbachev's perestroika, new thinking started, Russia built up a very successful and efficient relationship with the global South and global East. Will be almost as important task as an operation. That's very, very difficult, actually, because being inclined anti-Western, Russia has not a very big experience to work with the non-Western world. So it needs to be learned. And now I think for Vladimir Putin's term, that will be one of the most important priorities.
What do you foresee to be the likely resolution for the conflict in Ukraine? What objectives do you think Russia will have in place for post-conflict reconstruction and the political reconfiguration of the Eastern Europe region?
We don't know the exact result of this campaign. We don't know where the armies will stop at the end. Much depends on the configuration of Ukraine and configuration of Russia, this point when the hostilities will stop. That's one thing. Another thing, of course, we have a very tense relationship with NATO, with the United States. I still believe that this escalation game will not achieve the culmination, which unfortunately might include the nuclear factor. But certainly a relationship with the West is now going through extremely risky period. As for the post-war reconfiguration, I can say one thing. Contrary to what people in the West usually say and believe, that the main Putin and Russia in this war was territorial gains to get as much Ukrainian soil as possible and so on. So typical imperial revenge. Don't believe it was the real priority from the beginning. The whole crisis started much earlier than February 22, and it was generated by Russian very painful perception of the enlargement of NATO, which was seen by the West as actually the work for European security. To put it quietly simplified, the whole European security after the Cold War was based on the idea that NATO is equal to European security. The more NATO, the more security. Which was initially, I must say, was accepted by the Soviet Union and then by early Russia. But this acceptance was rather forced by the weakness, and that's why Russia started to be more and more vocal about this, as we believed, injustice later. So the main driving force of this war was security concerns on the Russian side about NATO expansion and NATO strengthening around Russia. And Ukraine was the final draw when it became clear that Ukraine will be not necessarily part of NATO, but certainly part of the NATO infrastructure, informal infrastructure. So the Russian reaction came in a very obvious way. But again, the memorandum which was issued by Russian Foreign Ministry in December 2021 was not about Ukraine per se. It was about European security, and it was a call to rediscuss principles of this security, the call which was ignored, or rather rejected by NATO and the United States, and that led to the military operation. So I think that any resolution of Ukrainian crisis should be based primarily on the acceptance and taking into account those Russian concerns about European security. Ukraine should not be included in NATO, and the non-aligned status, neutral status of Ukraine. This is one of the absolutely most important demands on the Russian side. As for the rest, again, initially, if we look at the so-called Istanbul discussions and agreements which were prepared but never signed, so Russia was ready to accept those big security principles and even give back significant part of Ukrainian territory at that time, at that moment. Now, and that was rejected for several reasons by Ukraine and the West. So since that situation changed, Russia made significant gains, and now it's much more difficult to discuss any territorial concessions on the Russian side. I don't believe it's possible. But of course, again, it is very important. The main issue in this crisis is not about Ukraine, it's about status of NATO in Europe. As long as we will not start to discuss this issue between Russia and the West, Russia and the United States, I'm afraid this war will continue.
The Middle East has gone back to being on fire again. What will Russia's main objectives in the Middle East be in the next few years in light of its alienation from Western powers? And how is Russia going to balance its relationships with various actors in the region, such as Iran, Israel, Syria, and the Arabian Gulf states?
Russian presence in the Middle East, especially after Russian intervention in Syria 2015, has grown very much. And for a while, Russia was one of the most important players there. Most important and unique players, because Russia actually enjoyed workable relationship with basically all. The only entity which Russia rejected by purposes of principal position was ISIS. All other actors, including Israel, Iran, Saudi Arabia, Hamas, Hezbollah, Gulf monarchies, Turkey, everybody, Syria, of course, Jordan, all those countries had a very constructive relationship with those countries and entities. And that was a unique situation because the United States, after what happened in Iraq and after the Arab Spring, lost a significant part of capacities in the region. Now situation changed, of course, because of Ukrainian conflict, but primarily because of situation in Palestine, the war in Gaza. And Russia is more on the side of Arab countries, while Arab and Muslim countries, while never aspired to break relationship with Israel, but objectively, Israel now is much more on the American side and Russia on the other side. I would dare to say that Russian priority in the Middle East just now is very much pragmatic. It's not about geopolitical role. It's about cooperation in terms of money, in terms of trade, in terms of innovations in some particular areas. And of course, Muslim world is such an important player on the international stage in general, not just on the regional issues, that Russia needs a lot of support now in the situation when the West is trying to isolate Russia. And in this regard, constructive, mutually beneficial relations with the Muslim countries, be it in the Middle East or somewhere else, is very needed for Russian Federation. I would say this is the main aim. Again, it's not about geopolitical transformation of the Middle East, because my take on the international relations at large just now is that no one wants big powers from the outside to play a decisive role in the regions, because the regional powers, they start to prefer to find their own solutions, and they don't need any big brothers, be it United States, China, or Russia. But in case they can strengthen their positions in relationship with all those big powers, of course they will do it. And Russia now needs to expand as much of constructive relationship with all these countries as possible.
How will Russia's relationship with international organizations and the international order be in the next 6 years under Putin? Will Russia seek a reform, or would it seek an overthrow of the post-World War II liberal international order and its structures?
I don't believe that Russia will seek a reform for one simple reason: no one believes that reform is doable now. I don't believe that Russia will seek to overthrow those institutions for one simple reason, because we see they being in decline without any special effort by anybody. The institutional framework of international system has been created after the Second World War, and that was a very successful take. It was a very sophisticated and a smart system, but adapted to the particular situation of the second half of the 20th century. And the whole system, international organizations, structures, they worked pretty well, pretty efficient. But now we see that they are in decline, not just because of behavior of particular countries, be it Russia, be it United States, be it Iran, be it China, whoever. It is because the completely changing international context environment. Yes, indeed, countries, including Russia, to behave a much more voluntary and free, say, way. But this is a reaction to the decline of international framework. So it's I wouldn't say that this is that Russian behavior or anybody else's behavior is the cause for that. Any institutions have a certain expiration date, and I'm afraid that now this date is approaching. As for the reform, here I would probably say a very politically incorrect thing. I don't expect any new world order to expect anytime soon, replacing the current one or the declining one, whatever. Because international structure, international system is such just now that you cannot simply create a balance between most important players and actors, which is necessary to build up an order. So you see at least, 25, maybe 30 powers of different scale and different caliber who influence international system in different way, by different means, locally, globally, regionally, but they do. And all of them play roles. How is it possible to balance them, to create a balanced system consisting out of them? I don't know. I don't see this opportunity. It does not mean that the whole situation will necessarily lead to all-out war, all against all. I think that since countries will start to realize that they cannot rely on the institutional framework anymore, they will start to behave in a much more cautious way, to understand the risks. And that might be sometimes better than to expect international institutions to intervene.
Ladies and gentlemen, you just listened to Editor-in-Chief of Russia and Global Affairs, Professor Fyodor Lukyanov. Fyodor, thank you for your time.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for listening to Strategic Wisdom. Be sure to follow and subscribe to us on whatever podcast platform you're using to listen to this show in order to not miss any future interviews and conversations that I bring to you on this podcast. Also, be sure to subscribe to Strategic Wisdom on Substack at strategicwisdom.substack.com. This is your host, Andrew Jose, signing off.